All right. Well, officially welcome everyone to today's Building Communities with Transformative Justice webinar. I am Torn Radiccioni. I am your website manager for Sustainable CT. So, without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and let it and pass the baton off to the moderators, Ahmed and Elizabeth. Guys, feel free.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. Really excited to be here with you all. First off, thank you all for your flexibility with us kind of rescheduling from last week. Really appreciate you all being flexible and kind of allowing us to kind of postpone this final session to today. So we're going to get started with some introductions. I see that some of you are already introducing yourselves in the chat, which is awesome. So I'll read through some of those before we get started. And I think at this point, you're kind of familiar with myself and Elizabeth. So unless something comes up during it, I think we're probably okay without going into deep introductions. But for those of you that are new here, and this is kind of your first session, Elizabeth and I are both sustainable CT equity coaches. And so whenever one of your towns is interested in working with an equity coach, which you're able to do year round free of charge, one of us might be the equity coaches that you interact with. And we're part of, I believe there's like 8 total really incredible individuals that are there to support you all. So let me read through some of these. So we have Mike Rosen from Tolland, town manager, he, him, his, participated in a few of these, and Tolland is a community that is engaging in sustainable CT, and we want to pursue bronze certification. Plus this topic is important. Awesome, welcome Mike. We have Nasreen Al-Amari from Connects. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but welcome Nasreen. We have Mary, she, her from Fairfield, learning more about how to be more inclusive is always of interest. We have Monica, pronouns she, her, hers, an assistant town clerk in Mansfield, Connecticut, was inspired to be here today because I'm interested in seeing ways that we can build a brighter future in our local communities. Awesome, welcome. We have Susan, she, her, hers, first select woman, town of Portland. I'm impressed with the series thus far, and I'm inspired to learn more today. We have worked with police, schools, and youth toward solidarity, equity, and justice. Thank you, awesome. And then we have Sierra. My apologies if I am mispronouncing that, but former sustainable CT intern in Marlborough. Awesome, interested in the topic and ready to learn. We have Annalise from Sustain here to learn and pass it along, wonderful. And then we have Hamza, she, her, hers, a former Sustainable CT fellow. Just wanted a chance to get to hear the great work that Ahmed and Elizabeth put together. Thanks, Hamza. It's good to see you. All right, awesome. Well, thank you all for sharing all of that. Really excited to be here with all of you. So, Torn, if we can go to the next slide. All right, so as you all know, this is the 4th session in our 4-session series about social justice. If you haven't had a chance to view all of them, all of the recordings are on the Sustainable CT website. And again, as always, if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to the staff. And if you'd like to go more in depth in any of these conversations or any other conversations that you could think of, feel free to reach out to the staff and request to work with an equity coach as well. Torn, next. All right, so just a few ground rules, and I know this is kind of repetitive for those of you that have been here with us before, but especially for this session in particular, really want to honor kind of that everything that we're discussing here today isn't something theoretical. It's not something that impacts people far away from our communities. It impacts people within this space. I know it impacts us as presenters in different ways. It impacts sustainable CT staff. It impacts our communities in a lot of ways, and we might not always be aware of that. I was actually just on a different call with like over 100 people, and everyone was talking about all of these challenges as if they're theoretical, right? As if they exist in various countries around the world and communities outside of here. And it's like, no, they're literally right here. right? Within our own communities, we're going through various challenges, and a lot of times we don't really recognize it within our neighbors, within our community, even just across like borders to the next town over. So really trying to approach today's topic and all these topics delicately, and then specifically, and thank you, Elizabeth, for this main point of really coming from a place of curiosity and not a place of defensiveness. We ask everyone to honor yourself and others. That also includes honoring your needs. We know that this is a difficult conversation, and so if you need to hop off for whatever reason and watch it later, that's perfectly fine. If you need to close your camera, that's okay. If you want to sit back and not participate at all, that's also okay. Whatever makes sense to you, and also honoring everybody here in terms of what they're sharing and what they're bringing forward, which includes communicating any of your needs. Feel free to let Elizabeth or Torin know about anything that kind of comes up. They'll kind of be here to support. I would say you could also message me, and also at the same time, I'll probably be talking a lot, and so might not be able to respond immediately. Balance sharing and listening. Really be mindful and intentional in terms of what you're here for, what you're hoping to come out of this, which I really appreciate a lot of you kind of mentioning in your introductions. And lastly, feel free to ask any questions. And I will say that even if you know that everybody else here already knows the answer to the question that you have, ask it anyways, right? We're here for each of you individually as well as for the group. So Torin, next slide. All right, so just a little bit about what we're going to be discussing today. So we're going to go into transformative justice and kind of what does that actually mean? What does it actually look like? And really kind of dissecting it a bit, little by little, for a very specific reason, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then really going into what components of transformative justice are we really able to bring into our communities, into our spaces, and honestly, even into our day-to-day lives, right? A lot of these conversations that we're kind of having and have been having, these aren't just work-related conversations, right? They're not just conversations when equity comes up and it's like, all right, now we have to talk about justice. All of these conversations really impact the way that we live our lives, how we interact with people around us. And that couldn't be truer for any of the conversations that we've had, more so than this conversation today, right? Every single one of these tools, even if you're, in a space where work-wise, you might not be able to bring in any of these tools, that doesn't mean that you can't utilize every single one of these tools, literally starting today within your day-to-day lives and with the individuals around you. So if we go to the next slide. All right, so I'm going to start off with a fairly large question that I actually want you to kind of consider right now as we kind of get started, and also just throughout this session, right? In terms of what does justice look like, right? And really think of what different messages have you received? What justice have you seen actually happen in your day-to-day life? Really thinking about what would be inclusive of that. And hopefully, depending on how in depth you've gone into this conversation before, hopefully throughout this 1 hour, we can kind of change some of those perceptions and some of those messaging. But just initial reaction, right? If somebody this moment asks you, what does justice look like? If you could answer in like one or a couple of words, what does that look like for you? And feel free to just type it out in the comments. And we can kind of take it from there. So Nasreen says equity and fairness. Awesome. I love that. Tiff says fair. Awesome. What else? Mike says moral rightness. Awesome. What else? Equitable outcomes. Wonderful. Unity. Awesome. What else? Dignity. Wonderful. So I love everything that you all just brought forward, and all of those are incredibly critical. And I see that we do have a few more, so let me read those as well. So using our power and systems to right systemic wrongs, absolutely. Sustainable results, wonderful. Mary says hearing from all sides. Annalise says equal value to society. Nobody is marked down. That's All of that is absolutely wonderful. And so if you think about it, right, thinking of all of these different things in terms of the fairness, in terms of the equity, in terms of the sustainable results, in terms of keeping in mind the systemic oppression pieces, what does it actually look like, right? Does it look like prison systems, right? Does it look like some sort of rehabilitation system? Does it look like what does it actually look like? Does it look like better schools? Does it look like more education? Does it look like more communal spaces? What would it actually look like if you're really thinking of when you hear the word justice, right? So when we say that justice has been enacted or whatever, right? Or we've gotten to a place of justice, in a physical sense, what would that look like? So Annalise says the end of othering, wonderful. What else? And again, I do want this question to be something that you kind of reflect on throughout this. So it's actually wonderful that we don't have as many answers at the beginning of this, right? And hopefully towards the end, all of a sudden we have some more answers. But I'll hold some space just in case folks have some thoughts from now. So Elizabeth says accessibility to resources for everyone. Nasreen says spread the wealth. Awesome. Mary says I like Annalise's answer. Absolutely. What else? Mike says, even if people have different beginnings and advantages, everyone getting a fair shot at a safe and fair life. Awesome. That's wonderful. Yeah, so I really appreciate all of those answers. And I really appreciate that the visions that you all have for justice are kind of expansive and they take into consideration a lot of the things that we have been discussing over the last month or so. Within mainstream society, right, like one of the things that that is profoundly invested within our communities, right, is this idea, right, or this concept that justice equals punishment, or that punishment is a pathway for justice, right? And so if you think back to individuals that have harmed you in particular, or harmed loved ones, or harmed your community, right, a lot of times, a lot of us will immediately go to like, all right, well, I want this person dead. I want this person in prison, right? I want this person gone, more or less. And that's okay to hold on to that, right? And at the same time, really honoring that that's not justice, right? That doesn't deliver any of the things that we've actually discussed, right? All that does is it spreads pain, right? It takes pain from you and it invests it into somebody else in different ways. And again, there's nothing wrong with holding on to both of those things at the same time. One of the things that we're actually seeing right now, right, as we're having conversations about police brutality, as we're having conversations about divestment from different police departments and different institutional systems, right, that haven't necessarily served all of us in the right ways or served all of us well, and hasn't really achieved what we would like to see with justice. Oftentimes, at least in every conversation I'm a part of, as soon as that comes up of like, well, people will be like, well, what happens to the murderers and rapists? Right? Anytime we talk about abolishing like the prison industrial complex and the prison system, that's the number one question that comes up, right? Well, you know, what happens to specifically, usually the one that comes up most is what happens to, and these are people's words versus mine, what happens to pedophiles and rapists, right? Even less so about murderers, right? Like that comes up later, but it's usually about when it comes to pedophiles and rapists that all of a sudden people are like, wait, like what about that, right? Like where do we send people for that? Like what do you mean there's no punishment? Like then all of a sudden everyone's going to be raping everybody and it's just going to be a colossal mess. And I'm right with you with all of that, right? In terms of like, that is a severe amount of harm. That's harm I myself have experienced within my life. A lot of my loved ones have experienced it within their lifetimes. A lot of people within my communities have experienced it within their lifetimes, and so on and so forth. And also at the same time, I'm constantly reminded of that less than 2% of individuals who are sexually assaulted, whether as children or as adults, less than 2% will actually see the perpetrators behind bars or tried in any way, shape, or form, right? The reality is 98% are not in prison systems. 98% are never actually punished for any of these things. And so really taking all of that into consideration is really where transformative justice started rising up, right? Of all of a sudden, the definition of justice that we all brought forward is very different than the definition of what we currently have. And also that the current justice system does not actually exist to protect all of us, does not actually serve all of us. And by all of us, I mean like almost like all of us, right? Like the fact that only 2% of individuals who have sexually assaulted an individual are ever behind bars or tried or ever punished for any of that means that this isn't even just about single identities. It's not about, even though there's different statistics, right? There's different statistics in terms of like the likelihood of you being behind bars, right? If you've sexually assaulted a person and you're Black, right? There's a difference between having a white female, for example, who is sexually assaulted versus a Black trans woman, right? And so on and so forth. All of those things exist. And also within that 98% means that every single identity, there are individuals within those that will fall through the cracks, that will never see their perpetrators actually brought to justice within the conventional way that we have. And again, I really want to honor that a lot of times we do hold on to both pieces, right? That we may be in a place because of the harm that's been done to us of like, I want this person punished, right? That's an easy response. And also honoring that like, I may hold that. And also I want to see true justice happen in the world. So if we go to the next slide. So when it comes to components of justice, right, and in different ways, some of you kind of alluded to this, right? But if we're breaking down justice in terms of how do we actually achieve that equity, that fairness, all of these different things, we're really discussing three different components that go into it. So we have accountability, we have growth, and we have healing. And so I didn't actually put these like middle images in there. It was just like PowerPoint, like with the design ideas, but to them, that's what represents each of those. And I really wanted to highlight like the accountability piece and the growth piece. The healing is a beautiful image, right? But accountability to a lot of individuals is just a checklist, right? It's just like, all right, did I do X? Did I do Y? Right? Did this person serve out a prison sentence? Did this person not? Are they on probation? Are they on parole? Whatever it is, right? And the reality is very different, and we'll go into that in a little bit. And same with growth, right? With this, it kind of makes growth seem as if it's like this sustained, standardized process where you're always just moving upwards. And the reality is growth is this messy, like random lines squiggling everywhere, right? Of at times we're growing in so many different directions all at the same times. And it's beautiful, right? And it's so much more complex than just what this image shows. But it's really these three core components that have to be present within justice for us to truly say that justice has existed, right? That justice has prevailed or has shown up, right? Whatever that looks like. And so if you think of any kind of harm that's been done, whether it's systemic, whether it's on an interpersonal relationship, whatever it is, right? Really thinking of instances in your life where all three of those actually were enacted, right? Where true accountability happened, where you yourself and the individual who perpetrated that harm grew, right? Where ultimately healing was achieved, right? Where all of a sudden it was no longer this, this abyss of pain, right, based on this type of harm. And all of a sudden it's another experience that we have that's on our pathway for self-actualization that allows us to move forward. But that healing is so critical, right? And so without those three there, and we can definitely break it down further, right? Like we can break down accountability, we can break down growth, we can break down healing, we can break down how systemic oppression is going to impact us differently in terms of healing, and how growth is going to be measured differently, right? For somebody who's Black versus somebody who's brown versus somebody who's white, and so on and so forth. And also, it's really this simple. It's really just these three basic things. And also at the same time, recognizing that justice is complex, because how many of us have truly seen all three of these things happening in our day-to-day lives? How often can we reflect on instances in our lives, again, interpersonally or systemically, where the other person or ourselves, maybe we're the ones that caused some harm, right? How many times have we been accountable and grew from the process and ultimately healed so it never happens again, and we're able to close the cycle of justice within that? Torrin, if we go to the next slide. All right, and so last but not least, before I open it up for any thoughts and questions, and again, feel free to add any comments and thoughts into the chat as I'm talking, but really also wanted to highlight, before we really dove into transformative justice, of, well, where is it, right? If we're talking about accountability, growth, and healing being kind of the core components of this thing called justice that you all identified as something that's equitable, something that's sustainable, something that's fair, something that actually honors people in different ways, where is it, right? And who is it actually extended to? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with things like cancel culture and how that exists within different spaces and within different communities. I know at least those are, I probably have that conversation almost every day or every other day, right? Within my full-time role and within organizing and within all of that. And it's always really interesting to get to that level of who within our communities is disposable and who isn't, right? Oftentimes, a lot of us, just mainstream wise, it's really easy to believe that it's people in power that are being held accountable for things and being disposed of, right? When they're not willing to be accountable. But the reality is it's the most marginalized that are usually the ones that are disposed of, right? From my experiences, I have never seen a cis straight white person disposed of. I can give you dozens of accounts of specifically BIPOC, trans, disabled, queer folks who have been disposed of left and right, right? I can give you examples of people who have actually died because of these things, because of violence that exists within spaces. I can give you instances where people have been deported, where people have been imprisoned, where people have left their communities over and over again, right? I can give you examples of people ending up in hospitals, various hospitals, for both physical and mental health related things. I can give you examples of individuals who have become houseless because of how unsafe their communities and their housing structures have become. Right? I can give you all of those examples, literally like in this moment, I can probably name like 100 instances where I have seen that happen. And yet I've never seen it happen to the most privileged, right? So really keeping that in mind of within our communities, just the way that they're structured systemically, right, gives different people different levels of disposability. And unfortunately, oftentimes it's people at the margins that are the most disposable. And so the reason I kind of end with that before jumping into transformative justice is because those are all the reasons that transformative justice existed in the first place, right? Transformative justice wasn't a group of us coming here together and we're like, hey, yeah, we're the most privileged, the justice system works for us, everything works, everything is great, all that kind of stuff. It was actually the most marginalized people coming together and being like, hey, like, we've never had access to the justice system. We've never had access to community resources because all of the funding in our spaces go to police officers or police departments, and they don't go to any social service programs. Or even when they go to social service programs, those social service programs aren't safe for trans, disabled, Black, Indigenous, POC folks, immigrants, undocumented folks, and so on and so forth. And so it was really a group of individuals that are the most marginalized that came together and said, well, if no one else is going to give this to us, no one else is going to come and save us, no one else is going to step up and build these systems out for us, what would it look like if we owned it? Right? What would it look like if we as a community came together and said that we're going to go through processes to achieve that justice? And that's really where transformative justice came from. And so I said in the very beginning that this is kind of a really delicate topic, and it's really because of that, because this wasn't made for all of us, right? Transformative justice, again, was built for the individuals that are at the margins, that have never had access to anything else, right? That could never pick up the phone and dial 911 because if they did, they themselves could get deported, right? Or more violence could be enacted against them. Right? Or you could even live in a state where both parties will always be arrested, right? And even in the state of Connecticut, just over the last couple of months, and within like the mutual aid work that my organization does and our organizing collectives do, we've probably received like the first couple of months, it was probably one domestic violence related thing, probably once every week or every other week. By the time May and June hit, it was probably every other day that we were receiving one. And a lot of them were, the cops were called, they arrested the wrong person. And now because we've arrested, a person has been arrested, that person gets labeled as the dominant aggressor. Once you're labeled as the dominant aggressor, that means all the social services that exist for domestic violence can no longer support you. So SAVE, so all the sexual assault prevention organizations, the organizations that would support you with legal counsel when it comes to anything related to domestic violence, the organizations that would support you with finding housing if you need to relocate, the people who would actually move you into a safe house because you are now labeled as the dominant aggressor, none of those are available to you. And I'm not saying that the police get it wrong 100% of the time, but even if they get it wrong once, which at least even from the last couple of months, it's been a lot more than once, that's a lot, right? That's an injustice in of itself, right? And so again, really want to be mindful of that, and that this conversation is less structured about you bringing transformative justice into your workspace, into your own communities, right? If you're not one of those populations that are severely impacted by all of this, and more of how do you take different foundational things of transformative justice and bring that to your spaces, right? So when we're talking about accountability, growth, and healing, right, which are core concepts of transformative justice, how do you bring that into your daily lives? How do you bring that into your workspace? How do you bring it into your organizing and so on and so forth? So I'll pause there for a little bit, see if anybody has any questions or any comments or thoughts. Again, feel free to add them in the chat before we really spend the next half hour around like transformative justice and then really digging deeper into the accountability piece, the growth piece, and the healing piece. I'm glad I brought water because I talked a lot.
One of the things that I'll just say that kind of comes to mind when I think about transformative justice, when I first kind of came across the concept, it was a real big paradigm shift. And I was first introduced it in the context of the criminal justice system. And so it was a huge paradigm shift to think of, because we're so conditioned to think, and Acme kind of said this at the beginning, if someone commits a crime, justice is carried out when that individual, is quote unquote punished or reprimanded for their mistake. But then when you start to break it down of how does that actually benefit and enrich communities by this person being punished? So you start to look at all the ripple effects of that person maybe going to jail and that family being disintegrated and them needing social assistance because maybe the person that went to jail was the primary breadwinner, and or maybe that now the child is put into foster care, and there's a whole myriad of impacts that happen when children go into foster care. So it's kind of looking at, okay, what was the crime, what was the wrongdoing, and is the justice really carried out for the community by this person being punished in that way, or is there a more comprehensive way we can look at it so it's truly benefiting on the side of the victim and on the side of the perpetrator, and what's the best way of addressing both sides to actually benefit the community. So I think it's a real flip from the way that, again, our criminal justice system currently operates and the way we've kind of been conditioned to think about how justice is carried out, and how little supports are actually given to the person that did the wrongdoing, right? We hear so much about victim supports, which are important, but what about, there's such a high recidivism rate. It's like, what supports are we giving for that person that maybe did this mistake, stole something or did a violent crime? How are we actually helping them heal so that they don't make these mistakes again? So it's kind of looking at things a lot more comprehensively and looking at healing on both sides.
Awesome, thank you for that. And I do see that there's a comment that I do want to read, because I think it kind of wraps a lot of this together. So Monica says, I think that it would look like a community where everyone has the opportunity to succeed in education, workforce, etc., where we value rehabilitation, fairness in our criminal justice system, and provides resources to those who are in need. Absolutely, right? And once we're able to achieve that, things like transformative justice won't be needed anymore, right? And that's the really cool thing with all of this, is that if we're able to get our communities to a place where everybody has access, right, where the vision of justice that we're discussing, right, that brings in equity, that takes systemic oppression into consideration, that focuses and centers accountability and growth and healing for everybody, right, then all of a sudden things like transformative justice won't be needed in that space. And unfortunately, until we get there collectively, right, as multiple communities and everything, it's still going to be a constant thing that we're working on, right? Because there's always going to be evolution within systems of oppression, and it's going to show up differently and for different people and in different ways. And so we just need to always kind of be mindful of that and continuously build out these alternative systems, these ways that actually make sense for everybody. And I'm hoping that a lot of you can take that back into, again, your day-to-day lives and your workspaces, and really initiate some of those conversations. And as always, a huge reminder of, like, equity coaches are able to support you with some of those conversations. Like, that is literally what we do. And so definitely feel free to reach out. So Torrin, if we go to the next slide, you can actually kind of define transformative justice. We've talked a lot about the justice component of transformative justice, and haven't really discussed the transformative piece. And so the way I would define transformative justice, so this is kind of my definition, is it's a practice to transform our communities that leads to justice for everyone, created by queer, trans, BIPOC, and disabled folks. So when it comes to the transform piece, what I'm actually referring to is we're actually doing the work to identify the root causes that exist, and we're uprooting those root causes, right? So if we know that the reason that, like last time we talked about how like 50% of individuals who are killed by police officers have a disability, right? And so if we're thinking of that, right, thinking of the root causes, right, going into that level of, well, what is the root cause of that type of injustice, right? What is the root cause of, what are the intersects, right, that exist within it, right? And so going into the levels of race, into how disability is viewed, right? How capitalism impacts both of those things, how ableism is a thing. We've talked about how we modify certain values, right? And move away from values of capitalism and into values of just human existence and being. That's really what we're referring to with transform, right? Transformative justice is meant as a daily practice, something that we could utilize and also always honoring that the end goal is the eradication of these systems, the eradication of the root causes of why these practices are needed separately within different communities. And so really keeping that in mind of, again, that end goal is always to transform, right? The end goal isn't just to make one situation better or 5 situations better. It's really to transform everything that exists within our communities and our spaces in whatever ways that looks like. So, Torin, next slide. So again, going into the transforming our communities piece, right? So it doesn't really matter what you call it. So some of you have probably been already introduced to transformative justice. Others may have been introduced to things like restorative justice. And I'll highlight just the difference there really quickly. So the difference between transformative justice and restorative justice is that transformative justice oftentimes happens entirely outside of a system, right? So transformative justice cannot exist within, like, for example, a police department. It can't exist within a hospital setting. Different tools within it can exist within those spaces, but then they would be restorative justice practices, right? Restorative justice looks at how do we amend the current system. Transformative justice goes into how do we build an alternative system. So really keeping that slight difference in mind, and you're able to utilize different practices in different spaces in different ways. And that's the beauty of having access to all of these different tools. But ultimately, we really want to ask ourselves 3 major things, right? How do we as individuals and communities be accountable for different things? And again, really thinking to times that you've caused harm, times that you haven't shown up in the right ways, times that whether it's for your work or within your community or within your own structure, where you have held onto problematic, systemically oppressive things. Because the truth is, every single one of us has, right? We're conditioned into these things from the earliest of ages, right? It's not as if like people are just able to, become 20-year-olds and never be introduced to patriarchy, right? Or white supremacy or capitalism or any of those things. We're all conditioned to them. And so we've all shown up in not the most helpful of ways in the past, and at times in really harmful ways, right? So how do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we work within our community to be held accountable and to hold our community accountable so that we all move forward? And then ultimately, how do we promote growth and self-actualization? I think last time there was kind of that question of what does self-actualization even look like within our communities? And hopefully you've all had some time to reflect and to kind of ask that question within your own spaces and your own day-to-day lives. And then ultimately, and this one's kind of really critical, again, whether you're doing any organizing work, whether you're working within any kind of system, whether you're doing anything at all, just that how do we heal and move forward? That's just so critical for us as individuals, right? In our day-to-day lives, right? How do we heal? How do we move forward from instances that have harmed us? How do we heal from harm that has impacted us, that has caused us to cause harm? How do we heal just from us causing harm in the past? Right? All of those are wounds, and we want to be able to heal and take the knowledge and the learnings from that, utilizing that growth, and to move forward. So we'll go deeper into each of those over the next 15 minutes or so. So Torin, next slide. All right, so accountability. So oftentimes accountability is kind of viewed as this checklist. And from a lot of my experiences, a lot of times when accountability comes up, in a lot of spaces, accountability is just I'm sorry, right? Or it's just I feel bad about harming you, and that's it, right? It kind of ends there. Accountability is so much more than that though, right? I'm sorry is a piece of it. An acknowledgement of the harm that's been done is a piece of it, but it's not accountability if it doesn't end, right? If I go and I harm, let's say Elizabeth, every single day with the exact same action, and every day I come back and I say, I'm sorry, there was never any accountability. There's no growth. There's no healing. It's actually doing more harm than good for me to go and try to apologize every day, because now all of a sudden, nobody knows what's going on, right? Of is this going to continue? Is it not? And also it is going to continue because I haven't actually done any of the work that's necessary. And so for me, accountability usually has 4 different pieces of it. And even though they're placed here, or the reason they're placed here kind of all on the same line is also because you're going to go back and forth between them, right? It's not a step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, right? Sometimes we'll take action before we even reflect on things. Sometimes we'll acknowledge things before we've truly done any reflection. Sometimes we'll feel like, all right, we've gotten closure, and also we actually haven't gotten closure whatsoever. And 6 months later, it's like, ooh, like I have not closed off that whatsoever, and I still need to work through this. Right? And so we're able to move between these different areas. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's actually a lot of beauty in that, is that we could have different starting points when it comes to accountability. Ultimately, though, we want to hit all 4 of these to truly be able to get to a place where there is that ultimate closure, right? And we're no longer in need of being constantly mindful of a specific action or situation. So we're kind of, and so I'm going to go through all 4 just fairly quickly, just so we're on the same page with all of them. So we're kind of starting with reflection, right? In terms of reflecting on, all right, like, why did I do this, right? What was the actual harm that happened, right? What was the actual response to all of this? Where is this coming from? What types of conditioning have I had that told me this behavior was okay, right? Is this behavior a response for something else? Is it that I've been hurt in different ways, right? Really going into those deeper layers of reflection in terms of why are we the way that we are? Right, in both the most beautiful of senses and also in ways of what are the areas of improvement that are still needed for each of us to get to that place of self-actualization. Right, and accountability is this really beautiful thing of that we're always growing throughout it. So any of us getting to a place where we're like, oh, I've never made a mistake, right? Like I don't make mistakes any of these days. I don't do that. That just means we're never growing. We're never moving forward. And so accountability is so necessary for that. And so we're starting with all of those reflections. And as we reflect on these things, we're able to begin acknowledging some of them, right? We're able to acknowledge, here's why I did this action, or here's why this thing actually harmed me in the way that it did. Or here is how this thing that I did harmed this other person, and acknowledging it to that person of I did X and here's the harm that I did, and then really moving on to action. And again, everything is interchangeable here of like you could move things. So you could have that action before you go to acknowledgement, and you could go to a person and fully acknowledge things and also say, here are the steps that I've taken so that this never happens again. Here's the action that I've taken. And in that space, it's either the other individual will be like, okay, cool, we're good. Or the other individual's like, okay, cool, we're good. And also I want you not in my life kind of thing. Like we're good, but you stay there, I'll be here. Or here's some other actions that I need you to do for this to truly be, for you to truly be accountable. And that's wonderful, right? Like when that actually happens, it's actually a really beautiful thing. And also at the same time, I want to recognize that how many of us were taught to just accept apologies in whatever shape or form that they come at you? I know I was, right? And so part of my practice a couple of years ago was literally for a 6-month period. Anytime anybody said, I'm sorry, I would always ask in different ways of, well, what are you going to actually do about it, right? Like, what are you going to do to make sure it never happens again? Which led to some really awkward situations, because it could be like somebody like not holding the door and apologizing, right? When I normally would be like, no problem. And it's really not a big deal. And also I wanted to really rewire my brain to be able to actually ask for the things that I needed. Because I had realized that I would accept people's apologies and in reality never actually accepted any of it, because there was no real accountability, because I hadn't had that closure. And so 6 months later, I would bring it back up again, right? And be like, well, what about that time? And to the person, they're like, but we finished that, right? Like that was over, right? And so those action steps are so incredibly important. Now, at times, people might come up with action steps that don't make sense to you as an individual, or they go against your own boundaries. And that's a conversation to have. That's okay, right? Of like, I hear you, I acknowledge that that's what you need, and here's why I can't do that one. right? What else can I do? And sometimes we're not going to get to the same page, and that's okay. Sometimes we both need to grow to get to that same page. Sometimes we're able to get to it immediately, right? And that's ultimately what leads to that closure. And sometimes even once we've hit closure, 2 years later, maybe we forgot. And that's okay too, right? We're in that constant state of growth and moving towards that self-actualization. So Torin, next slide. So really want to highlight a concept that's deeply ingrained within transformative justice, and that's community accountability. So community accountability is very different than interpersonal accountability. So let's say I harm Elizabeth and Elizabeth wants to hold me accountable, right? We go through the process that I just mentioned and it's beautiful and we both move forward and we get to wonderful places. Community accountability takes it one step further. Community accountability says, the reason that I caused harm also exists within my community, whatever that community looks like. It could be a community center, it could be a workspace environment, it could be a town, it could be whatever it is. And it says that, let's say I've committed an act of like patriarchal violence against Elizabeth, right? Patriarchy exists within those spaces. There are certain things that move me towards that type of harm and committing that type of violence. There are certain things that allow it to go unquestioned, right? There are things that prevent Elizabeth from accessing resources once that harm happens. All of those are community-related things. And so when we get into a community accountability, it's no longer an Ahmed and Elizabeth situation. That's a part of it. And it's also, well, what about the rest of us, right? What about the 15, 20 people that are a part of this community that also played a role in this? What can we do? How can we be accountable? And so it moves away from just a one-to-one situation, and it really allows our entire community to transform, to move forward together, versus in one situation, justice has happened, and also we haven't acknowledged anything that happens within the community. And so 6 months later, it's another person who's committed that harm, and so on and so forth, right? And that's a practice that you could bring into any of your spaces, again, within organizing, within work-related things, within your interpersonal lives, because our families are a community. Our friends are a community. Anything that's more than like a few people is a community, and you get to define it for yourself, but really thinking of, well, how do we do that, right? Maybe it's a friend group, maybe it's a family structure, maybe it's extended families together doing this work. And ultimately, that actually just looks like justice, like everything that we've been discussing. So Torin, next slide. So when it comes to growth, and I feel like we've talked a lot about growth and healing, even though we haven't really dived into each of them separately, really just wanted to highlight a few things that are necessary for us to truly grow in unrestricted ways. This isn't saying that if these 3 things are not achieved, and these are just 3 out of hundreds of things, but 3 that I wanted to really bring into the space, it's not saying that if you don't have safety, that you can never grow. That's not true whatsoever. There's a lot of people that will never have safety in their day-to-day lives. That doesn't mean that they're not growing and self-actualizing. That's not true whatsoever, right? We can find that safety within ourselves. We can find it within our, a lake. It could be within a connection. It could be in a lot of things. And also we could still feel unsafe 100% of the time. And same with all these other things. And also at the same time, that restricts us. It makes it much more difficult for us to truly grow in the ways that we truly need to and would want to, right? In the way that we were intended to, right? It's almost as if like you're planting something and then you're also putting a layer of cement on top of it. That plant is going to grow beyond that cement, right? Like it's going to shoot through, and also it's going to have a much more difficult time than a plant without that cement. So really think of it that way when it comes to these 3 things. Of not having them is that layer of cement, or that layer of anything that's impeding us moving forward. So the first one is safety, right? And really thinking of, and I feel like we've been here together for like a month, and so I can, go much more in depth, with some of these things and really be very like upfront. In the state of Connecticut, it's a very, very segregated state. Many of your towns probably have 95% white people. Many of your towns probably don't know any trans people, might not actually like physically see any disabled people, right? Might not see an undocumented person or know an undocumented person. All of those things are there on purpose, right? It's not as if we woke up one day and it was just like, wow, natural order of things, and everyone just, avoided this place and that group of people went to that place and it was just natural migration. No, it was very intentional, right? And we talked about zoning laws and redlining and gerrymandering and all these things in previous sessions. And so that safety is hard to come by for certain groups of people in various areas across the state, right? If your town hasn't permitted a Black person to live in that town until the 80s, there's going to be a level of unsafety within that, right? If within your town, there's kind of this recognition of that trans people don't exist in that space, and also at the same time, I know like 2 people that actually work for your town who are trans, there's a level of unsafety in there, right? Or if queer people don't feel safe to be out and say that they're queer, there's a level of unsafety in there. And so really thinking of that, of who has safety within all of your spaces. And I'm not saying that you're the one that caused that, right? Very few of us were, or no, none of us were here in the 1600s, right? Some of us may have been here when certain zoning laws were put into place, and maybe we didn't know the difference at the time, right? Some of us may have just seen it and we had no role to actually play in it at the time, and so on and so forth. And also at the same time, we need to recognize that these problems exist. Which brings me to that second point, because one of the things that we've done within communities is we've changed who's able to make mistakes and who isn't able to. So certain groups of people are able to make small mistakes and be okay with it. Other people can make smaller mistakes and serve our life sentences in prisons, right? We need to move our spaces, whether that's our schools, whether it's our government offices, our town offices, our community centers, into spaces where people can make mistakes, where they can learn and be held accountable, right? We want that accountability, and also we want to learn. There was recently, just a few days ago, there was a report released about Waterbury school systems, and there were instances in there of highly documented of, because a 4-year-old threw a temper tantrum, the cops were called, right? That within a 6-month period, that 200 calls were made to the police for individuals under the age of 12. Within 6 months, between last September and March, right? What messages does that send our kids? What messages does that send the rest of our communities if as a 4-year-old, you can't make mistakes? And ultimately going into conflict transformation, I love conflict. I love it when people get into disagreements and don't agree on things and all of that. And I'm not talking about disagreements in terms of people's like lives, right? And somebody coming to me and being like, I don't think you should exist, right? Like that's not that kind of disagreement. But I'm talking about the everyday things, excuse me, and really thinking of how do we transform our relationships because of those things? How do we resolve and move forward and rebuild our relationships in different ways? That's going to allow us to grow, but only viewing. So for example, if we view like one person of like, it's like, all right, we have to be friends for the rest of time, that impedes our growth. That doesn't allow us to get to a place where, you know what, maybe we're not right as friends. Right? Maybe we need some time apart. Maybe our friendship needs to be reconsidered, or maybe it just needs to evolve into different things. All of that is that conflict transformation that I'm referring to. And then if we go to the next slide, then we only have a few minutes left, so I'll do this fairly quickly. When it comes to healing, we're talking about the same things for growth, right? And just bringing them here. And also, we're talking about an end to the injustice. Right? A lot of times when we talk about things like PTSD and different forms of trauma, we neglect to mention whether or not that injustice is over. Healing for somebody who has left a toxic relationship and is no longer within that and actually has time and space to heal is very different than a Black person in the United States today that is dealing with constant daily microaggressions that literally does not get a day off from that, right? Or a trans person who doesn't get a day off from being misgendered every single day, right? And so for that true healing to happen, it helps to have that injustice end, which really goes back to that accountability, right? Where we want to end these problems. We want to go back to our communities and figure out why did they exist in the first place, and let's get rid of them because it will actually help us all heal. It will help people move forward. And a piece of that is going to go reflecting on the impact that things had on us, right? If I get misgendered every day and I never have space to reflect on what has that actually done for me, right? How has that impacted me? I might not be able to move beyond it without acknowledging the response that I had to it of maybe now I don't go to certain spaces. Maybe I don't go to certain support systems because they're close to people who misgender me or whatever it is. And ultimately, we want to get rid of those root causes. And by root causes, I don't necessarily mean that we have to wait until we end white supremacy and all of transphobia and gender injustice and all of those things to move forward. I'm talking about, well, what are the things that allowed these things to impact us in different ways? For our sakes, how do we heal from those things without waiting for systems of oppression to completely disappear? I hold hope that they will one day. I hold hope that we will get there and our communities will. And also, I'm not going to wait for anybody else to get there first, right? I'm still going to focus on my healing, and I'm going to move forward from the damage that white supremacy and patriarchy and gender justice and all these things have caused. And also, I'm going to work on getting rid of those systems at the same time. And ultimately, we're reclaiming our strengths, right? Of that, we're amazing individuals. We're powerful people, no matter what the world is telling us and no matter what messages we're receiving. And oftentimes, that's one of the core things for healing after forms of violence, after constant types of oppression, all of that, to really going into really reclaiming our strengths and moving forward. And the next slide. So won't go into this, but wanted to kind of just accidentally reflect back on our definition of environmental justice. So all of us are here because we do some sort of sustainability work, right? Really holding on to these conversations as pieces of sustainability is critical for our communities to truly move forward, right? It's not just about access to food, water, and safety. It's all of the things that prevent us from those things. It's the need for transformative justice within different spaces and for accountability and an acknowledgement of how different forms of injustices have impacted us. So really always hold on to that and keep that in mind as you do this work, is that this isn't an equity conversation. This is a sustainability conversation. This is part of everything we do. And Torin, last slide, I think. And last but not least, another reminder, as we always have done, right? If we're building things, so we're talking about sustainability here, if it's not for everyone, especially the most impacted, it's not justice. It's none of the things that we've been discussing. And I really hope that you'll all kind of take that first question back to your own communities in terms of what does justice look like? What can it look like today? And what does it need to look like next year? And the year after that, and 10 years from now? And ultimately, how do we get there? How do we fully transform our communities? So with that, I know I am over time by 2 minutes, so I apologize for that. But thank you all for being here with us for the last 5 weeks. You're all incredible. Again, as a reminder, these are all conversations that equity coaches are able to support you with. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that equity coaches we're able to support you with for the equity action that you're going to do. And also we're just able to support you with different conversations that might not lead to an action, right? So if you're like, hey, our community isn't ready for an action about, the LGBTQ community or something, that's okay. We can still have those conversations. We can build towards those actions in future years, in future times, and so on and so forth. And so please feel free to take that opportunity and utilize that form of support that's available to all of you. And hopefully we'll continue having these conversations, and we'll see you all soon. We don't really have time for any questions, but feel free to add any questions in the chat, and I can do my best to just, or Elizabeth and I will do our best to get back to you all, either via email, or we could utilize that as a way to do a different session in the future. But thank you all for being here. You're all amazing. And a huge thank you to Elizabeth and Torin as well. Y'all are awesome.
Well, all right, everybody. Thank you for attending. We really appreciate everybody's commitment to attending these 4 webinars. Again, I've been working alongside 2 of the most wonderful people. Our equity coaches are great. I hate to reiterate this, but for free hours for registering with Sustainable CT, it would be a shame not to use those hours in this case. So thank you to our moderators. Thank you to everyone who attended. This will be available on our Sustainable CT support page, which I will be uploading and posting the materials as we speak. And we will look forward to what the future holds. I'm assuming we will be wanting to do these more in the future, so hopefully we will have the opportunity to do so. So thank you. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you soon.
Hi, everyone.